What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my third channel, so if you want some more what ifs, go check out my other channels. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. At the proctor's call, all the genin who'd won their matches made their way back to the floor. Naruto grinned with pride as he looked from side to side. Sakura looked just as proud while Sasuke was smirking. They'd all made it to the finals. Only one other team could say that. As Naruto reached the bottom of the steps, he spied Fu across the room. She had turned to Kaido when they crossed paths. As he made his way back to their sensei, she said something he couldn't hear, and he waved her off without looking back. She turned away from him and looked troubled as Jichi shrugged and resumed walking. She then noticed him looking at her and smiled. He smiled back and nodded. Soon enough, all the genin were lined up in front of the Height, while his fellow proctors flanked him on either side, and the Hokage stood behind them. Height covered his mouth and coughed. He then took a moment to take a breath before he continued, "Congratulations to all of you who are going on to the final round." He then stepped to the side and gestured for the Hokage to step forward. "Now Lord Hokage, if you would please." Hiruzen nodded and took his place in front of the sickly Jonin. "Listen closely. I will now explain the third phase of the Chunin exams," the third god of shinobi said, looking over the genin. "As I said earlier, many prominent people from across the nations will observe the final stage of the exams. For that reason they will be held 1 month from now." "In a month," Naruto said before closing his eyes and crossing his arms. "Well, I guess that makes sense. Not like you can call up a bunch of VIPs from all over at the drop of a hat. As we send out the invitations and organize the event, you all have the opportunity to take this time to make preparations." Hiruzen continued. "What does that mean?" Kankuro asked, frustration punctuating every word. "Unlike everything up to this point, you're no longer dealing with unknowns," the third Hokage explained. "For the most part, you have now witnessed your rival's abilities firsthand. In addition, your abilities have been put to the test. Consider what you know of them and yourselves. Train and prepare for the fights ahead as best you can." He paused, probably waiting to see if anyone else would speak up. After a moment he continued, "Now before you're all dismissed, there's one last thing we have to do." He then gestured toward Anko, who stepped forward with a box. "You will each draw one sheet of paper from the box. I'll come around, so wait your turn." The purple-haired woman said. One by one each genin took a slip of paper from the box. When it was Naruto's turn, he opened it to see an 8. "Are we drawing lots? All right, now tell us your numbers, starting from the left." Yep, it looked like he was right. They were doing this like a tournament. One kin said. 3 stated Fu. 11 came from Jichi. 2 Gaara said Doli. 5 stated Temari. 12 said Kankuro. 7 Hinata said. 8 Naruto said. 4 came from Sasuke. 10 Sakura said. 9 said Lee. 6 said Shikamaru. "All right, now we will reveal the matchups for the final stage," Hiruzen announced before turning to Ibiki, who was writing on a handheld board. Ibiki, he finished with a nod. Ibiki nodded in return and held up the board. Kin versus Gaara, Fu versus Sasuke, Temari versus Shikamaru, Naruto versus Hinata, Sakura versus Lee, Jichi versus Kankuro. Naruto heard Hinata gasp beside him and he grimaced as he went over the matches. Great, 2 of his friends were fighting, and the winner would probably have to fight Gaara. He glanced at Sasuke and Fu, both of whom stared at the board with a frown on their faces. "Now you can all start preparing or resting as you like, provided there are no final questions." Hiruzen said. "I've got one," Shikamaru said, raising his hand. He then cupped his chin and thought, "If we're doing this like a tournament, then does that mean there can only be one winner?" "Not quite," Hiruzen replied with a smile. "Your performances will be judged by myself, the Kazekage, and other ninja leaders, as well as visiting lords. Those who we feel meet the qualifications will be promoted to Chunin." Fu smiled, clasping her hands in front of her chest. "Does that mean the chief will be there?" "So that means we could all become Chunin," Temari stated. Hiruzen nodded. "Yes, or conversely, none of you could. Nevertheless, advancing gives you more opportunities to appeal to the judges. Is that a satisfactory answer?" He paused one last time to see if there were any further questions. When there were none, he said, "Very well, thank you all for the effort you have exerted. Thus far you are all dismissed." As the genin began to disperse and return to their sensei, Naruto turned to Sasuke. "So, any idea what you're going to do if you win your match?" Sasuke grunted and closed his eyes before smirking. "What else? I'll fight." Sakura looked worried, but Naruto grinned and nodded. "Thought so." He then turned, looking past Hinata, who'd only just started to move, to Fu, who was walking toward him. "Hey guys," she said as she neared. "Hey." Naruto greeted her. For his team, the mint-haired girl then looked uncertain as she looked from him to his teammates. "It's not a problem that I'm going to be fighting Sasuke, is it?" "Of course not," Naruto replied with a dismissive wave. "In fact, I was just thinking of that tour we talked about." He smiled and put his hands behind his head. "How about you meet me at the North Gate tomorrow at 5? Sound good?" Fu's face lit up with excitement. She raised 2 eager fists in front of her chest. Sounds great, then I guess I'll see you there. Fu nodded before she turned and ran to catch up with Chi-Chi, who had been walking back to their sensei without her. Later she yelled, waving at him over her shoulder, "See you then." Naruto replied as he and Sakura waved after her while Sasuke gave her one wave and a nod. "Well, she seems excitable." The familiar voice of their sensei came from behind them. They turned to see Kakashi standing there with his hands in his pockets. "Guess you weren't exaggerating, Kakashi-sensei." The silver-haired Jonin gave them one of his eye smiles. "I'm glad to see my faith wasn't misplaced. I'm proud of you." The three Genins smiled. "How about we celebrate once we get out of this forest? I know where Naruto will want to go," Sakura said, looking at the blonde. "Pretty sure half the village would." Sasuke pointed out. Naruto just chuckled. "Well, it's not like I have a preference," Sasuke said with a shrug. Naruto turned to Sakura, who seemed to think for a moment. "Might as well." Yeah." Naruto pumped a fist into the air as soon as Fu and Chi-Chi had returned to their Jonin. He'd told them they needed to talk together. They had traversed the forest and returned to the village proper. Fu had watched the trees speeding by, wishing once again that she could explore the massive training ground from top to bottom, but there was no chance of her sneaking off with Yoro there. Soon enough they'd made their way back to the building they were staying at and met in their Jonin's room. He sat on the bed while Kaido sat backward in a chair. Chi-Chi leaned against a table while Fu stood at the window looking out at the village with a smile as Chi-Chi finished telling their leader what had happened since they left for the exams. Konoha was so much bigger than Taki, especially considering a lot of Taki was taken up by the lake in the heart of the valley, and there were so many people. The streets here were so much more crowded than they were backing home. It had been so exciting seeing the different buildings, walking around the busy streets as everyone went about their day. Looking up at the Hokage monument as one of the citizens kindly told her one of the first things she'd done was climb to the top, and the view was amazing, as great as the view from Taki's sacred tree, and no one knew who she was here. Her attention returned to her leader when she heard him hum and thought, "Well, firstly, good work making it this far." Chi-Chi, Fuyaro said, nodding at the two. Fu smiled and Kaido snorted. "Yeah, if there was ever any doubt she'd make it to the finals," he said. Looking away, Fu looked at him sadly. It sucked that he was the only one of them who didn't make it through the prelims. She didn't mind him being bitter. Well, she did, but it was like Shibuki said. People didn't understand her, and until that changed she doubted they'd warm up to her. That wasn't going to happen in just a few days, but she believed it would someday, and Shibuki did too, and he was always right. Well, almost speaking of Shibuki, she turned a hopeful look to their temporary sensei. "Do you think Shibuki will be here for the finals?" Yoro shrugged and crossed his arms. "Probably. It's been a while since Taki's had a chance to remind everyone of our glory days. I can't imagine he'd miss out if he had a choice." Fu squealed in excitement at that Shibuki was coming. Probably this was her chance to make him and Taki proud. She had to win. That meant she couldn't back down, not against Sasuke or even Gaara. "Anyway, let's talk about that little exchange we saw back there," Yoro said, and Fu jerked and turned towards him. The Jonin sighed. "I was hoping Chi-Chi and Kaido could keep you reined in." "Really? Have you met her?" Chi-Chi asked with a raised brow. Yoro let out a long breath and closed his eyes. "I guess I can't fault you for how you handled things in the forest given your training and how unfamiliar with each other you were. Splitting up was a good call, and it did net you a scroll pretty quickly. Of course we should have just turned Fu loose from the start," Kaido said. "May I still say that was risky, but I can't lie and say it didn't work out." Chi-Chi replied with a shrug. "It was too much to hope for that you'd keep your head down." Yoro asked, looking at her. Fu pouted. "But how else am I going to make friends, and doesn't putting myself out there make me look less suspicious than making a big deal out of talking to people, I suppose? And it did pay off with the warning that kid gave you. You think his tip was good?" Chi-Chi asked. Yoro nodded. "Yeah, the way that Shino kid just forfeited the moment he saw he was up against Gaara. If you were willing to throw away all the work he put in getting here, he'd have forfeited like that older Genin." He then looked to the ground and frowned. "Besides, when you were all lined up I saw the look in his eyes. Yeah, I got a bad feeling from that kid." He then looked at Fu again. "You've got your work cut out for you. First, the last survivor of the Uchiha clan, then Gaara. I trust you're up to it." Fu frowned and looked down as she thought it sucked that she had to fight her new friend's teammate, someone she hoped to add to her list of friends before she left, but at least they didn't have to fight each other. Gaara, on the other hand, her frown deepened as she recalled what Naruto had told her, a merciless foe that went out of his way to kill his opponents, and the way he killed almost made her shudder. She wasn't going to back down and run, especially not with Shibuki watching and Taki's name at stake. But she wouldn't lie and say she wasn't worried, and yet she also couldn't help but feel sympathy for him since she'd heard about the sand and had learned what that meant. She had a pretty good idea of how he wound up the way he did. Of course she'd had a taste of it herself, but she was snapped out of her thoughts by her leader. She looked up and smiled at him. "Yeah, there's no way I'm letting Shibuki down. And don't worry, I've got some Ideas for how to handle Gaara, don't we? Nodded. Good. For then clasped her hands together hopefully. So will you let me go out and play with my new friends? Well, you did have a point, especially since everyone already knows what you're like now. Never mind that, I'm pretty sure you'd try to sneak out if I said no. Hoo, she cried, throwing her arms up in joy. Yoro looked at her sternly. As long as it doesn't cut into your training, and you don't do anything that might tip them off about you, I'm not stupid, you know. Besides, I promised the chief, didn't I? After celebrating at Ichiraku's, Kakashi-sensei had told them to take the rest of the day off. They were to meet up again first thing in the morning to start their training for the finals. This time, though, they were to meet on some rocky outcroppings far outside the village. Naruto couldn't help but wonder why they were meeting so far from their usual spot. What kind of techniques was their sensei going to teach them? He couldn't wait to find out. The three arrived at the appointed time, and Naruto and Sakura gaped in shock. Even Sasuke could only stare wide-eyed at the sight that greeted them. Kakashi was waiting for them. The silver-haired Jonin was sitting on a boulder and casually waved at them. Yo, right on time. WW, what? Naruto exclaimed. Kakashi-sensei, you're actually on time. Hey, that's rude, you know I can be on time when the situation calls for it. Sakura's eyes darted around frantically, searching for unseen enemies. What is it? Is Orochimaru up to something? Are we being targeted? Is the village in danger? Alright, enough of that. Kakashi deadpanned. He then swept his arm out and, gesturing to the ground in front of him, sit down. We need to have a talk. The genin did as they were asked and sat down in a row in front of Kakashi. The Jonin looked over them and sighed, closing his visible eye. This conversation is long overdue, the man began, but before we get to that, there's something we need to get out of the way. He looked over his student, stopping at Naruto. Naruto, what I have to say is mainly for you. Although there's a bit I'd like Sasuke to hear as well. However, Sakura is also on this team and I don't think we should leave her out. So Naruto, I'd like you to tell her who your father is. Naruto stiffened, eyes widening in shock. He turned to Sakura, whose gaze was shifting back and forth between him and their sensei. Sasuke just stared at Kakashi curiously. I suspect Sasuke's already figured it out. Oh, that was why he didn't seemed too surprised. He was probably more interested in where Kakashi was going with this. He looked back to Sakura, who was looking at him worriedly. He didn't have a problem telling Sakura about that, but he was a bit concerned Sakura might put the pieces together of what happened on the night he was born. There wasn't a lot there, but if she looked deeper, not that he didn't trust her, but he didn't want to talk about that. And the more people who know a secret, the easier it got out. But Kakashi was right. They were a team. He'd have to talk about what was sealed inside of him eventually, but for now he took a breath and then said, my dad was Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage. Sakura blinked once, then again, then her jaw dropped. Wait, were you serious? But that she then looked at him deeply. He could see the realization in her eyes as she realized how much he looked like his father. Naruto, are you really? She breathed out in disbelief, and Naruto rubbed his cheek. Yeah, hard to believe, huh? But that makes no sense, Sakura said with a frown. Lord Fourth was practically a legend. If that's true, you should have had people beating down the door to take you, and not to mention he must have had some property left that should have gone to you. She then glared at Kakashi. Why did everyone treat him like a pariah? If he's the fourth son, why'd he grow up all alone when everyone and their mothers should have been there for him? That was the part she focused on, the fact that he shouldn't have grown up on his own. Naruto couldn't help but feel warm inside. Kakashi closed his eye. He looked away and to the side, looking a bit anxious. For the first time for as long as Naruto had known him, there were a lot of reasons, one of which you've already heard. We wanted to keep his identity safe from his father's enemies. Politics was another that said there are a lot of people who should have been there for him. He then looked at Naruto, myself included. After all, his father practically raised me. Wait, what? Naruto gaped at the man who looked down at him, sadness in his only visible eye. Minato was my sensei. The genin could only stare at him at this admission. For a moment there was silence as Naruto took in this information. My dad was your sensei? Naruto asked slowly as his shocked expression turned into a glare. And this is the first I'm hearing about it, he asked, his voice transitioning into a growl. I'd never even heard of you before I graduated. The blonde stood up, anger coursing through him as he remembered all the times before Iruka had warmed up to him that he'd watched other kids get picked up by their families when he'd return to an empty apartment and just fall into bed in his silent room. Where were you all these years? Naruto. Sasuke spoke up, getting his attention. The Uchiha was frowning as he looked from him to their sensei. I doubt he'd just bring this up if he didn't have an explanation. Sakura looked between Naruto and Kakashi, shrinking in on herself a bit. Maybe we should hear him out. Naruto looked at the pink-haired girl. She looked concerned and uneased at the same time. It made sense. He guessed this was going to be pretty personal. He took a moment to rein himself in and sat down. Thank you, Kakashi said before he took a breath. It's a long story and it's not one I like telling, but you deserve to know. Naruto frowned, but sat back and waited. Have you ever heard of my father? Tsukumo Ataki. I doubt it. It's not a name spoken of very often. Anymore, seeing no sign of recognition in his students, he continued, "My father was an incredibly skilled ninja. In fact, he rivaled the Sannin. He was known as Konoha's White Fang for the white chakra saber he wielded, and was one of our most respected shinobi until a certain incident. He looked to the ground. I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say, while on a mission vital to our village, he was forced to make a choice: save his comrades and abandon the mission, or leave them to die to succeed." Naruto frowned, feeling some trepidation about where this was going. That brought back memories of the day they became a team. That must be what Kakashi had been thinking of when he gave Sakura that ultimatum to kill him or watch Sasuke die. Naruto wanted to say he'd do everything in his power to do both. He knew he would try, but that was neither here nor there, and the way Kakashi was talking, this story didn't have a happy ending. Kakashi would go on to prove him right. He chose the former. He saved his comrades, and the failure was so damaging that he was left completely disgraced. Everyone scorned him, even the shinobi he'd saved. He fell into depression, and in the end, I came home one day to find he'd hung himself. Naruto recoiled as if struck, and he saw Sakura flinch beside him. Both looked horrified. Sasuke frowned deeply, looking disgusted, whether it was at the other shinobi for acting that way or Sakumo for leaving his son to find him like that. He couldn't tell. "You can see why I don't like talking about my past, I'm sure," Kakashi said. But why?" Naruto asked. "He saved lives, didn't he? What was he supposed to do? Just leave them to die?" "Yes, he did save people, that's true, but what if saving your friends means sacrificing others more than the people you saved?" Kakashi asked, and Naruto couldn't answer. "It was an intelligence-gathering mission. My father abandoned it for the sake of a handful of his comrades, and because of that we were blind to enemy operations, and our forces walked into ambushes. Dozens of our shinobi died who likely would have lived otherwise." The silver-haired Jonin continued, "I decided not to repeat that mistake. I would put the mission before all else, including my comrades. I decided that anyone who didn't follow the ninja rules was trash and didn't care about my allies, or I tried not to." He then looked at Sasuke. "It was a relative of yours who showed me I was wrong." Sasuke grunted with a frown. Kakashi nodded. "This is the part one wanted you to hear about. My teammate, Obito Uchiha, and where I got this," he said, raising a hand to his covered Sharingan. Obito was a lot like Naruto. Funnily enough, he wanted to be Hokage too, and for similar reasons, the type to try and help anyone he came across. Kakashi then chuckled fondly. "The three of you remind me a lot of my team. I was our Sasuke, aloof and distant, and my final teammate, Rin, had talents similar to Sakura, a sweet girl who cared for us and the village deeply. She always got in between Obito and me when we fought. Well, when Obito came at me anyway, my views really rubbed him the wrong way. Obito loved her, but well, she loved me, not that I returned her feelings." Naruto blinked. That was a weird coincidence. It sounded so much like how they were before the wave mission. It wasn't exactly the same from the sound of it. Rin was nicer than Sakura used to be. Kakashi sounded like he'd been more apathetic than Sasuke. Even then they were so similar. Minato tried to teach me to value my comrades, remind me that we aren't just tools. He put us through the same bell test I gave to you, but I was a bit too smart for my own good." Kakashi said bitterly. "I realized what the test was, but it didn't change my view. Rin and Obito were just a means to an end." He looked up to the sky. "Minato-sensei was a better leader than I've been, that's for sure. He never needed a kick in the ass like the debacle in the Land of Waves. He was always there for us, always trying to remind me to value my teammates as he valued us. He never hid that he was the closest thing I had to a father for most of my life." And Kushina would come by from time to time. For a moment he just looked at the sky with a fond look in his eyes. "So that's how you knew my mom?" Naruto asked. Kakashi nodded. "They were already married by the time my teen was assigned to your father." Rin asked how they met. "Once. I'll tell you that story some other time if you'd like." "Yeah, I'd like that, Kakashi-sensei," Naruto replied quietly. Kakashi closed his eye and continued his tale. "We were around your age during the last war. During one mission while Minato-sensei was away, Rin got caught by IWA ninja. I wanted to go on without her, but Obito refused. He even hit me. It was there that he made me see those who'd abandoned their friends were worse than trash." He looked back down at them. "He left to save her on his own, and I followed. We rescued her together, but the IWA ninja we were fighting collapsed the cave. They'd taken her to Rin and I were okay, but Obito was half buried beneath boulders. The pressure was the only thing keeping alive," he said, now staring at the ground. Naruto felt cold for a moment. He was back on the bridge watching what he thought were Sasuke's final moments. "I'd lost my eye fighting the IWA ninja. His last act was to ask Rin to transplant one of his to replace it. I promised that I would protect Rin for him." He closed his eye. "I didn't even manage to keep that promise for half a year." He paused, then gave them a moment to digest that, then continued, "I pretty Much regress to how I'd been before Obito opened my eyes. I tried to block everything out, just focus on the mission and forget. That's become how I deal with grief after my father. He closed his eye again. Guy Minato-sensei and Kushina spent years trying to pull me back out of that. Minato-sensei even put me on guard detail for Kushina during her pregnancy just so I'd see well life. They just managed it right before the QB attack happened. Naruto flinched and once again there was silence. He looked to the ground thinking of everything he'd learned. So I take it you pulled back from everything again? Kakashi grunted an affirmative and nodded. I went back into ANBU and poured myself into my work, tried hard not to think about anything that would remind me of the past. That included you. I did check up on you on occasion early on, but not nearly enough, and for that I'm sorry. Naruto silently contemplated all that he'd learned while his teammates looked at him. He could understand why Kakashi hadn't been there. That didn't really change how he felt. Finally he said, I get it, I'm not completely okay with it, but I get it. Kakashi nodded. Thank you, that's better than I was afraid of, and while I wasn't there for you before, I am now, and I'll do my best to make up for it. And if you want to know more about your father, I'll gladly tell you everything I can about him. He then looked at his students. I told you my story for 4 reasons. 1, because I thought Naruto deserved to hear it. 2, because I wanted Sasuke to hear about his relative. Naruto looked over at the Uchiha who was staring at the ground thoughtfully. Kakashi continued. 3, I wanted you to learn from my mistakes. You need to be able to lean on each other, something you've made great strides towards, but don't pull into yourself if you're hurting as I did, and never see yourself and those around you as tools. And 4, to explain how I know what I'm going to teach Naruto. Naruto's brow furrowed. What do you mean with the competition you're facing? You're going to need something more than just upping your training. That's why I've decided I'm going to teach each of you a trump card technique. While we're at it, he looked at the Uchiha. For you, I think you're best suited to my original jutsu, the Chidori. Its speed makes it dangerous for anyone without a dojutsu or extremely accurate sensor abilities to use, and learning to use a second element will give you more options. He turned to Sakura. To you, I'm going to teach a technique I picked up a while back from an IWA ninja. It's a chakra flow technique that requires a great deal of control. It not only enhances your physical abilities but makes you nigh impervious to physical attacks. And for you, Naruto, he said, his gaze settling on the last member of the team, I'm going to teach you a technique your father invented. Naruto's eyes widened. A technique from my dad. A storm of emotions brewed inside of Naruto as he walked behind Kakashi. Well, one of the man he'd created 2 shadow clones to give each of his students one-on-one instructions on their techniques. On the one hand, he could barely contain his excitement. He was about to learn a super awesome jutsu, and it was his father's own technique, like a piece of him that he'd have. On the other, he was still mulling over all that he'd learned of his sensei's past. Frustration, sympathy, the hope of learning more about his parents all warred inside of him, as well as one thing he was worried about. Kakashi-sensei, he finally voiced what had been on his mind. The man half turned to look at him. Was part of the reason you weren't there for me. If you're going to ask if it had anything to do with your seal, the answer is no. Kakashi said he didn't need any more clarification on what he was talking about. What I told you is all there is to it. He let that sink in before he continued. Anyway, this looks like a good spot. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a scroll. Let's get started. Naruto looked on in anticipation as Kakashi placed the scroll on the ground. With a burst of chakra, the scroll exploded into smoke, and when it cleared he saw water balloons. Naruto could only look on incredulously at the pile of differently colored water balloons in front of him. That's right, this is the first step to learning your father's jutsu, Kakashi said with a nice smile. Kakashi-sensei, are you playing a prank on me right now? Naruto asked skeptically. If he was, this wasn't a very good one, and he knew pranks. I suppose a demonstration is in order, Kakashi mused. He then walked to a nearby boulder. He held out his hand, and all Naruto could do was gape at what followed. An orb of chakra formed. Naruto stared at the blue sphere, chakra visibly spiraling in multiple directions. Within it, Kakashi reared his arm back and then shoved the orb into a boulder. It tore through the stone with barely any resistance, sending chunks of stone in every direction as it carved a large portion out of the rock before finally disappearing. Kakashi nodded. I'm not the best with it, which is why I don't normally use it, but that's more or less what you're aiming for. Whoa, was all Naruto could say as he stared at the damage the technique caused. That technique is called the Rasengan, Kakashi explained. There are 3 steps to learning it. He then formed another orb of chakra in his hand. First, you must learn to rotate your chakra the way you see inside the sphere. Then you need to focus enough power for it to work. Finally, with all that power you must keep up the motion while keeping it all compressed like so. Oh, Naruto began as realization struck him. He then turned to the pile. So those water balloons, that's right, the balloons are here for you to practice the motion of your chakra on. He then picked one up and held it forward for Naruto to see. The surface shifted, bumps popping up and receding all over it before finally it burst. Your aim is to do that By rotating the water inside it with your Chakra. I see. Naruto nodded excitedly. Just you wait, Kakashi-sensei, I'll have this down in no time. He then ran to the pile and picked up one balloon. He began to shift the water, but it just bulged out into an oblong shape and occasionally shifted in other ways. After 2 minutes of nothing, he chuckled sheepishly. This is harder than I thought. Don't worry, you'll get it. In the meantime, why don't you create a few shadow clones so we can touch up in other areas? Sasuke stood with his eyes closed, his hands formed into snake seal, channeling his chakra as he'd been instructed. He focused the chakra into his hands, and tiny sparks of blue electricity came to life around them. He doubted they'd do much more than sting someone at this point, but it was a start, no different than when he'd learned the fireball jutsu. Easier. Even while it wasn't his element, he had far better control of his chakra than when he'd pushed himself to learn that technique. As he opened his eyes and took a moment's rest, his mind returned to Kakashi's tale. He had wondered how Kakashi had gotten one of his clan's eyes ever since he'd found out about it. Well, now he knew. Obito, the boy who'd taught Kakashi that those who abandoned their friends were worse than scum, who thought of his comrades' well-being even in his final moments, lending his strength to a friend even as he lay dying. It sounded like he'd been a credit to the Uchiha clan. It was a shame he'd never met him, but then he supposed it might be better that way. At least he didn't live to see their family slaughtered by one of their own. It had him thinking of his dream of reviving his clan. He'd focused so much on avenging them that part had fallen to the wayside. What kind of image did he want to craft them, and what kind of legacy would he leave for the next generation of Uchiha? The Uchiha of the past had been cold, distant, hiding their emotions, holding tight to any grudges they had, and maybe that was part of what had led to their downfall. He'd never given much thought to what led to the massacre before. Now that story and his own interactions with his team had him thinking what had led to Itachi snapping the way he had. Could anyone have done something? And if he did revive the Uchiha clan, it would be in his image. Did he want the Uchiha to follow in the footsteps of someone devoted to hatred? Was that the sort of example he would set, the path he'd want future generations to follow, one of hatred? Or Sasuke? Kakashi interrupted his thoughts. The Uchiha turned to look at him. Something on your mind? It's nothing, just something I need to figure out, the Uchiha replied. He paused for a moment, then said, if I need your help I'll ask, but right now I want to figure it out for myself. Hours later, Naruto walked through the village, eyes focused on the ground and his brows furrowed deeply. Not long after his team went their separate ways, he'd found his mind wandering back to the talk he'd had with Kakashi. It had been there the whole time. As he cleaned up and got ready for his promised tour with Fu, his sensei had been his father's student. He still found that hard to believe. It reminded him of how many connections his father had to have had, how many people must have been close to him, and the only one who ever reached out to him was the old man. How many other people had known his father and not done anything, and why? To help keep the secrets surrounding him, because they had their own families, because they couldn't be bothered? Or was it because of the Kyuubi? At least Kakashi had had a reason. It sucked that he hadn't been there, but he did understand to have gone through all that. He remembered how much it hurt to think Sasuke had died for him and they hadn't even been that close at the time. If he lost him, then Sakura, Kakashi and Iruka, yeah, he understood how that would make you want to just pull away from the world. He really shouldn't have been dwelling on it right now. He was almost to the gate, and Fu had been so excited he wasn't about to break his word to her, but then maybe that's just what he needed. A distraction. Training had worked wonders. Speaking of the mint-haired Kunoichi, he looked up as he approached the gate and saw her leaning against it with her hands behind her back. She noticed him immediately and ran towards him with a bright smile. Naruto, she said with a wave that he returned. Hey Fu, he replied without his usual enthusiasm. She quickly realized that something was wrong, though her smile dropped, a concerned look coming over her face as she came to a stop. Is something wrong? It's nothing, don't worry about it, Naruto said with a wave of his hand. It doesn't look like nothing, Fu replied with a frown. You look like you've got something on your chest. Want to talk about it? Maybe I can help. Not really, Naruto replied. He then forced a smile. Besides, I promised you a tour, didn't I? Just need to get my mind off of it. The blonde then turned around and started to lead her away, so he was stopped when she suddenly grabbed his hand. He turned to look and found Fu looking at him with a determined expression. Fu, and then she ran, dragging him with her down the streets. Hey, wait a minute, Fu, where are you going? Fu nodded with her hands on her hips, smiling as she looked down on Konoha. Yeah, this is perfect, she thought aloud. The mint-haired girl stood on top of a Hokage monument. She turned to Naruto, who was staring out at his village before his gaze went to her. When my team and I got here, this is the first place I went. The guard told me what this place was and I thought it'd be the perfect place to get a view of the whole village. Have you ever been up here before? She asked. Naruto rubbed the back of his head once or twice. He then smiled sheepishly. And I may have painted over all the Hokage faces as a prank. Fu blinked briefly, rendered speechless. Naruto hadn't mentioned that one before and no one stopped him. Did that mean he'd managed to pull this off without anyone noticing until he was done? How she stared for a moment before she began to giggle helplessly. How did you manage that? She asked through peals of laughter. I guess I'm just that good. Holding her stomach as she finally managed to get herself under control, she turned to see him still looking a bit embarrassed, but smiling slightly. Progress. She gave him a small smile. Taki's built around this one massive tree, bigger even than the ones back in that forest. I climb it and sit in the branches whenever I want to think. The view always helps me, she told him, sitting down. After a second he followed suit. Try it, and if you want we can talk about what's bothering you, or we can always play if you really want to take your mind off of it. She reached into the pouch at her side and pulled out a deck of cards. See, I brought cards this time. That got an amused snort out of him. Yay. She let that hang in the air, waiting for him to reply. Finally looking back at the village, he began. I'm an orphan, Naruto began. No one wanted to adopt me, so I've been on my own for as long as I can remember. Fu winced. My whole life I've been wondering about my parents. I finally learned more about them a little while ago, and more I wish I could have met them, and today I found out my sensei knew them. He was really close to them in fact, and he only now told me about it. Fu frowned. Just now? Naruto must have graduated months ago. What the hell took him so long? That was just his sensei must have known how much it meant to him. How could he keep silent about that? And if he was close to them and Naruto had just now heard about it, did that mean he hadn't been a part of his life until he'd graduated? He must have seen her face, because he added, I don't blame him. He had some pretty heavy personal stuff going on. But that got me thinking, how many other people knew my parents? Why didn't anyone at least tell me where they were? I spent years asking why I didn't have any parents, and no one ever told me. He shrugged, not knowing what to say. Silence fell over them as the pair gathered their thoughts. After a few moments, Fu nodded. I think I get it, she said, her gaze falling to the ground. People who should have been there for you turned their backs on you, and didn't that hit close to home? She looked up at him with genuine sympathy. I know the feeling, she admitted, and he met her gaze. She smiled then, but at least someone's trying, right? You have people who are there for you now, and not just because of your parents, don't you? Naruto nodded. She nodded back and continued, then focus on them. Try not to think about who maybe should have been there, and focus on everyone whose life can be harsh enough without negative thoughts dragging you down. You know, Naruto seemed to think that over for a minute before he nodded and smiled. Yeah, I guess you're right. Fu returned his smile, and the two fell quiet again as the silence stretched on the mint-haired girl raised her deck of cards and began to shuffle with a surprising amount of skill. The cards flowed from one hand to the other, practically dancing in her palms. She saw Naruto look over at her fascinated and giggled. I've had a lot of time to practice. Naruto returned the chuckle with one of his own. I can see that he tore his eyes away from her card tricks to refocus on her face. So, what about you? What are your folks like? Couldn't say, I barely know them, Fu answered without taking her eyes off the cards. Naruto blinked, gaping at the girl. What? Fu shrugged. They gave me up when I was little, really little. I didn't even remember them honestly, she admitted, still smiling as she shuffled. I ran into them a few years ago, but well, it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. For a few moments he could only stare at her as the sound of shifting cards filled the air. Finally he managed to say, I'm sorry. Fu turned to look at him, tilting her head to the side. About your parents? Naruto replied, trying not to sound pitying. What she just said, it was pretty much his worst here for most of his childhood. The answer he was afraid he'd get every time he asked the old man about his parents, and she'd actually lived it. I'm sorry they abandoned you. Fu then returned her attention to the cards. No big deal. She then held up the deck, her shuffling complete. Big deal, get it, she said, giving another small laugh before she dealt out the cards between them with expert precision. Naruto ignored the cards in front of him. He didn't quite know what to think now. This cheerful girl had just told him she had been abandoned by her parents, and she said it as simply as she would. Her favorite side dish for ramen. What was even more concerning was how she answered. There was no sadness or anger or anything. She had stated it as a point of fact. When Naruto thought back to all the years he'd spent alone, he had to admit he was bitter about it. Even after finding out the truth, the pain, the anger, the sadness of being alone, they were all still there for him, if only just. But she seemed strange, and if Naruto was completely honest, infuriatingly free of all that, and his curiosity got the better of him. How can you say that? He asked her just as she finished dealing. Fu looked at the cards she dealt, herself a satisfied smile appearing on her lips. She then looked over her cards at the blonde. She cocked her head again in the same manner as before. What do you mean your parents abandoned you? Why don't you feel anything about that? She blinked once, her head cocking even more. What do you mean? She asked again, sad, angry. He said your parents left you alone. How can you not? He stopped short. Not what? Naruto gave the word a once over, unsure if he should say it, but in the end he couldn't help it. He had to know. Hate them, he finished quietly. Understanding dawned on Fu's features. She collapsed her deck of cards and put them in her lap. As her eyes closed she ran her fingers through her hair and Took a deep breath. Well, I guess I did at first, she admitted. I didn't know anything about them at first. My village chief sort of adopted me unofficially. He raised me with his son Shibuki, but he was busy most of the time. It took Shibuki a while to warm up to me, but as far as I'm concerned they're my family. As for my parents, the mint-haired girl paused for a moment as Naruto looked at her sadly, unable to fathom how she must feel. I'd always wondered who they were, so you can guess how much it hurt when I finally met them and they didn't want anything to do with me. Well, to be honest, most of my village doesn't. I was sad and angry for a long time, but Shibuki was always there for me, and eventually I realized something that made the anger and the sadness go away, and it never came back. A realization about people. What? Naruto asked. What was it? Fu's genuine smile grew to its usual size. They didn't know me now. It was Naruto's turn to cock his head in confusion. How? She laughed out loud at his bewilderment. They didn't know me, she said again. All the people in my village, they don't know me. All everyone knows is the story of how my parents cast me out. They don't know the first thing about me. And how do people react to things they don't understand? Naruto was left speechless. I guess they can't relate to it, can't trust it, he asked. Fu practically jumped at him, pointing a finger directly in his face. Exactly. She jumped to her feet. I mean, look at me, she said, giving a twirl. I'm smart, I'm fun, I'm cute, I'm a strong kick-ass kunoichi. What's not to love? She asked, giving a loud boisterous laugh. Naruto couldn't help but smile widely. Her positivity was absolutely infectious. So I realized all I need to do is make them see me for me, the real me. That's part of why I want to be friends with so many people. Naruto, she said, tenderness now in her eyes. Friendship is like the ultimate knowing of someone you know. Naruto thought back to how alone he'd felt before Iruka and all the people who'd come into his life since then. Yeah, I think I do. He then looked at her curiously. So how's that worked out for you? Fu rubbed the back of her head. It's a work in progress. Things have gotten better, but I've still got a ways to go, but someday I'm sure I'll win them over. She turned her head upward, then looking into the sky with hope. Even my parents, one day they'll see the real me, and I'll be friends with them too. Naruto's smile somehow grew even more. I hope you do, Fu. Then everything was quiet for a few moments. The two were lost in thought. Fu had a point. Naruto realized after all that was why Iruka came around, because he understood. Naruto saw that he wasn't the monster sealed inside of him. Fu then shook her head and broke the silence. Enough of this sappy stuff. She sat back down and picked up her cards, which had scattered when she stood up. We got cards to play. Let's get it on. Yeah, alright, Naruto said, still enthused by her speech as he picked up his cards. A thought then ran through his head, and he looked over to her. What are we playing again? Fu looked at her cards, then at him. Fu trailed a bit behind Naruto, her hands behind her back and a smile on her face. Today was yet another on the mint-haired girl's list of good days since she'd been allowed to join in the Chunin exam. She'd managed to pull her friend out of the funk the morning had put him in, and knowing she'd been able to help him warmed her heart. And then the tour, it was everything she'd hoped it would be. Konoha was so different than Taki. There were so many sights to see and places she couldn't wait to visit over the next month. Konoha had a hot spring. How many villages could say that? Not many. From what she knew, Taki didn't, that was for sure, and you could tell from how good the place looked that it saw a lot of traffic. She'd have to take a soak in them at least once before this was all over. In Kikyo Castle, it was easily the largest building she'd ever seen. It was a shame Naruto hadn't known what it was for, but in some ways that made it better. She could let her imagination run wild. Maybe some VIP had sunk a ton of money into it trying to rival the Land of Fire's lord, or maybe a prince or princess had come to Konoha as part of some agreement, or it might have been a meeting place for the leaders and clan heads to meet. In the past, she and Naruto had fun trading ideas back and forth for a bit. She knew it wasn't a place for the feudal lord to stay when he came to Konoha, because they had a VIP hotel with a room just for him, just while the lord of Taki's land never went to the village. Okay, that might have been because Taki was an actually hidden village, but still. But now it was almost over. The sun was hanging just over the horizon, dyeing the sky orange, and the streets were beginning to thin out. It was a shame it was almost over, but she was still excited for their last stop, Naruto's promised best restaurant in Konoha. Her stomach rumbled as she imagined what she was about to try. She was surprised when he turned and said, "And here we are," gesturing with a flourish towards the unassuming restaurant nearby. Ichiraku Ramen. Fu questioned, reading the name on the logo aloud. Yep, the #1 restaurant in Konoha, and the best place for ramen on the whole continent, Naruto said, turning to the shop and practically bouncing on his feet with excitement. Come on, he yelled as he ran inside. Fu grinned widely, infected with his enthusiasm. If he was that excited, it had to be good. Wait up, she called out as she ran in after him. Well, if it isn't our favorite customer, a man's voice called out just as she entered the shop. She saw it was an older man behind the counter, just finishing cleaning a bowl. 2 days in a row. What's the occasion? He then turned to her, smiling warmly. And who's this? Hey old man, Tucci, this is my new friend, Fu. Naruto greeted, gesturing toward her as she sat down beside him. She came from Taki for the Chunin exams. I just got done showing her around the village and thought I'd finish up with the best restaurant in Konoha. Tucci put the bowl down before turning towards her, smiling warmly with his eyes closed. Well, nice to meet you Fu. Same to you Mr. Fu began with a smile before trailing off uncertainly. The chef waved off her concern. Tucci's fine. It was then that a young brown-haired woman stepped out from the back of the shop. And this is my daughter I am. Hi Fu greeted cheerfully, smiling widely and closing her eyes. Hi to you too I am, said before turning to Naruto. Any friend of Naruto's is a friend of ours. Fu beamed with joy. Two more friends, she'd have to come back and get to know them before she left. It's good to know you two aren't going to let a little competition stand between you, the waitress continued. Why should we let something like the exams get between us and getting to know awesome new people? Naruto asked, putting his hands behind his head. What he said, Fu added, raising her hand. I am, chuckled as Tucci stepped up to the counter. So what'll it be? I'll take a bowl of miso ramen with a pork fillet, Naruto said. Fu thought for a moment. It all looked pretty good, and she wasn't picky. It's not like she got the chance to eat restaurant quality food that often back home. Besides, she'd be coming back anyway. I'll have what he's having. Tucci nodded. Got it. 2 orders of miso pork ramen coming right up, he said before turning to the kitchen area. Fu watched as he began to prepare their meals, seamlessly switching between stirring noodles, preparing broth, and throwing pork on the stove with precision honed through years of experience. So what do you think of Konoha so far? I am asked. It's amazing, Fu answered excitedly. It's so much bigger than Taki. I mean, you've got a castle here you don't even use anymore. We don't have anything even half that size. And there are more places in just one market than all of Taki, and that's not even getting into the hot springs. Naruto chuckled. Yep, it's pretty great, right? He then looked away and scratched his cheek. Well, I mean, it's not like I've been to many other places, but I don't think there's any place I'd rather live. You know, Fu nodded. Yeah, I know the feeling. I hope to travel the continent and see everything in the world someday, but in the end, Taki's my home. For all that the other villagers put her through, she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. I am nodded. I think most people feel that way about the place they were born. It's always got a special place in your heart, doesn't it? Fu nodded. Exactly. All right, orders up, Tucci said as he walked towards them with 2 steaming bowls of ramen. Naruto looked down at the bowl, eyes shining with anticipation. Looks great as always, old man. Tucci, he said, grabbing a pair of chopsticks. Thanks for the meal, he said quickly, before breaking his chopsticks apart and digging in so fast she almost thought he'd been channeling Chakra that only served to stoke her own expectations. Eagerly she mimicked the blonde's movements before sinking her chopsticks into her bowl. She was much slower at pulling the noodles out, however, wanting to savor her first bite. She brought the noodles to her lips and her eyes widened as the noodles touched her tongue. It was so good. The broth had a near perfect balance of flavors. It was salty but not too much, and she could taste various other seasonings, none of which overpowered the others. There was a hint of the pork that meshed perfectly with everything else, and the noodles were so fluffy they practically melted in her mouth. Wow, it was the best ramen she'd ever tasted. Ramen wasn't exactly her favorite dish. There were plenty of things she'd eat instead, but this blew just about any other meal she'd had out of the water, and it was such a simple dish too. Her pleased surprise must have shown on her face, because Tucci nodded and crossed his arms with a content smile. Another satisfied customer. You can say that again, Fu replied before slurping down another bite. This is so good. I wish I could cook like this. It's miles beyond the kind of stuff I usually have, and I bet it would make Shibuki so happy. Naruto blinked. How you cook for the Shibuki guy? Fu nodded. Sometimes, she said, a bit more subdued than she'd been. She then looked into the broth, stirring the noodles. Naruto seemed to notice as he'd stopped slurping down his food. You know how I told you Shibuki's father adopted me, more or less? Yeah, Naruto replied with a concerned frown. Well, you see, she took a breath. He died a few years ago defending our village from some enemies who got a bit too close for comfort. Naruto's eyes widened before he looked at her sadly. Oh, I'm sorry. Fu shook her head. You didn't know, she said before she continued. I know it's not how most villages work, but the chief's job is hereditary in Taki, so even though he was young, Shibuki became the new chief after his father, Kyo. It was hard on him, well, on both of us, but he worked hard and did his best. He was struggling at first, so I wanted to help in any way I could, and one day I thought, why not make sure he had a warm meal waiting for him when he got home like Kyo used to make us. I couldn't think of much else I could do. I mean, I was only 8. Well, that's thoughtful, I am, complimented her, and Fu smiled back. I hope he appreciated it. She nodded. Oh, he did well. Once I got him to try it anyway. Noticing their looks, Fu rubbed the back of her head sheepishly. This was a bit after that the first time I tried to cook something for Shibuki. Well, let's just say it's a good thing I decided to taste it myself first. It had looked fine, but it wasn't. It really wasn't. The meat being undercooked was just one of many problems with it. And if the taste wasn't bad enough, a while later Fu wound up with a terrible stomach ache. Could have done without the hospital stay though. Oh, Naruto replied before chuckling awkwardly. Well, I see you didn't let that stop you from trying. Fu nodded, smiling again. Nope, I never give up on anything. I took that more as a challenge than anything else. I hear you, Fu. Naruto replied with a grin. I don't back down or run from anything. I better not, since it's my dream to be Hokage. That jogged Fu's memory. Oh right, that's what you said when you fought Neji, right? Naruto nodded vigorously. Yep, to be Hokage is my dream, and I'm not stopping until I make it that way. Everyone in Konoha will have to acknowledge me. Well, I'm rooting for you, Naruto, Fu said, and he grinned at her. Same here, Teuchi said, and I am. Nodded in agreement. Thanks guys, Naruto replied before looking to Fu. So do you have a dream you're chasing too? Fu shrugged, leaning back and closing her eyes. Aside from seeing the world and making 100 friends, not really. I'm more for living in the moment, you know, she asked before she slurped down more of her noodles, humming happily at the taste. Not too long after they found themselves ordering seconds. Fu stopped there. Naruto, didn't I trust you finished sending out the last of the invitations? The third Hokage asked, leaning forward on his desk with his hands interlocked together. Yes, Lord Hokage. Iruka nodded, standing at attention before his leader. The elder shinobi nodded and closed his eyes. Good, now it's just a matter of seeing who will respond. With a sigh, the third Hokage stood. He walked over to the window and looked out at the village with his hands behind his back. Iruka wondered what the third god of shinobi was thinking as he looked out at their home. Knowing the man as he did, if he had to guess, he was worried. His mind was probably on all the people who shared the village with them, understandably, given the looming threat of Orochimaru and whatever he had planned, and of course it would be a member of Naruto's team being targeted by the snake Sannin. He couldn't help but worry about what lay ahead for all the students from his former class. They may no longer be his students, but he'd watched them all grow up. The village could be in danger. War might be on the horizon now that Orochimaru had Oto. They were still young, he thought as he followed his leader's gaze out the window. Sure, the rookie genin wouldn't be the first kids their age to see the harsher aspects of shinobi life, but no one that young should have to see what war brought if you asked him. And of course, if it wasn't bad enough that one of his former students was at least one of Orochimaru's targets, it had to be Naruto's teammate. He was worried for all his former students, but most of all for the boy who'd become like a younger brother to him. Naruto had already endured so much, and just as things were looking up, one of the most dangerous criminals in the ninja world targets someone close to him. There wasn't much he could do given who they were up against. All he could do was hope things turned out okay. Speaking of his younger brother figure, his eyes turned back to his leader, Lord Hokage. He began, and the man half turned to face him. There'd been something on his mind ever since he met up with Naruto at the forest. Things had been so busy between the exams and Orochimaru that he hadn't had a chance to ask. Now, with nothing urgent for either of them, it was a good time to ask just what else Naruto had gotten himself into back in the forest. If I may ask, what's the story with that girl Naruto brought to you back in the forest of death? The scarred Chunin asked. Hiruzen closed his eyes. That he said before letting out a sigh. Oh boy, from the look on the man's face this wasn't going to be good. Naruto hasn't gotten in over his head, has he? No, rest assured the problem has been resolved for now. Naruto was quite right to be concerned about her, Hiruzen replied as he returned to his seat. I've granted her asylum. She's being vetted as we speak. Well, it was good to know he hadn't been exaggerating or taken advantage of hearing. That's a load off my back. Still, it goes without saying that taking in a foreign ninja during the Chunin exams is. Yes, Hiruzen replied as he pulled out his pipe. It didn't need to be said what that would do to a village's standing and the other nation's trust in them, but these were extraordinary circumstances. He took a drag from his pipe and breathed out a plume of smoke. There's no harm in telling you. I suppose I should begin with her identity. The girl's name is Karen Uzumaki. Iruka's brows shot up. His jaw dropped as he stared at his leader Uzumaki. Then that girl's related to Naruto? Hiruzen read his expression and nodded yes, and the DNA test we've administered confirmed she's a member of that clan, making her a distant cousin of Naruto. The third Hokage then explained the girl's circumstances and the consequences of her mother's choice to seek asylum in Kusa. When Iruka learned of the Uzumaki's ability to heal others with their vitality, he hadn't thought much of it. It was useful, very much so, from how powerful it apparently was, but it was just another tool in the end. That is, until he was reminded she and her mother had gone to Kusa. He had a bad feeling about where the story would go, knowing what they were like. He was quickly proven right. His brows furrowed as he grit his teeth, his hands clenching as Hiruzen explained what had happened to her so far. Inoichi and the others have found no sign that she's tried to deceive us. In truth, she downplayed her experiences. She didn't mention their attempts at manipulation. praising her for her hard work only to deride her as an outsider should she ask for a break, or that they forced her to use what meager savings they'd allowed her to cremate her mother's body after she died healing their ninja. Iruka growled. So that's why. Hiruzen nodded. What's going to happen to her? From the looks of things, she'll be inducted into the village once our inspections are finished. Hiruzen told him. Beyond that I don't know, it's up to Karen to decide what path she'll take. While she may have been sent here for the exams, the girl is a genin in name alone. She's had none of the conditioning of a shinobi and was only given the most basic physical training to make her easier to transport. She doesn't know how to fight, conceal her presence, or even use the most basic of jutsu. Fortunately, that means Kusa is likely to assume her dead. Iruka took a breath, focusing on what had happened to her. Wouldn't change anything at this point. Well, at least her ordeal is over. Hiruzen nodded, and from the looks of things both she and Naruto will have blood family they can lean on. Iruka smiled at that. That's right, for so long the blonde had been alone, had dreamed of having a family to come home to. He knew well what that was like, and it looked like he might get it, and from the sound of it she'd need someone there for her as much as Naruto. Had he looked out the window, he hoped they got along. He knew it didn't always turn out that way, but family should be there for each other, and with what might lay in the future they could need it. Naruto growled as he focused on the balloon in his hands. It was to no avail. He was doing better than before. The rubbery surface of the balloon churned in different directions, but it wasn't to burst the material. He sighed, calming down a bit. He shouldn't be surprised. Kakashi had told him this was an A-rank jutsu, one much harder than his shadow clone technique. He said it was the pinnacle of shaping chakra, so he knew it would be hard, but it was so frustrating. It just seemed so simple. Spin the water with your chakra until it popped the balloon. Yeah, easier said than done. Days had passed since he'd started training for this technique, and he was still on square one. He sighed and set the balloon down, standing up and stretching before he began to walk over to the bookcase. So much had changed in just a few months. Looking back, deep down Naruto had known that he wouldn't have been able to back up any of what he said back in the academy, but now just look at how far he'd come back then. Pretty much the only ones who'd give him the time of day were Iruka, Hiruzen, Tochi, and I am. Now he had Sakura and surprisingly Sasuke. Given their past, Kakashi, Mabuki, and Kazashi there for him too. It warmed him having bonds with all those people, and of course his new friend Fu. They'd hung a few more times over the past few days. He'd be sad to see his fellow hyperactive genin go when the exams were over. Hopefully they'd be able to keep in touch somehow. Reaching the stack of books on ceiling he kept on his nightstand, he picked through them for one of his newer ones and went to make a hand sign. And wait a minute, he turned back to the balloon and ran over to it. It was so simple. Why hadn't he thought of it before? He went to spin the water and this time put his left hand on top of the balloon. With the added influence of both hands, the balloon's sides roiled until pop. The balloon burst. Naruto stared at the puddle before he grinned and cheered, leaping into the air and raising a fist. Yes, I got it. Wait until I show Kakashi-sensei. Great, now try it again without the other hand, Kakashi said the next day. Naruto blinked, looking up at the man in disbelief. Naruto, you should know that Minato-sensei had a preference for techniques that didn't require hand signs jutsu, that he could spring on his opponent at a moment's notice, Kakashi explained, closing one eye. The fact that it can be used with one hand and its speed are some of its biggest advantages. While I'm glad you thought outside the box and made it work your own way, using both hands would hamper the technique. Darn, Naruto grumbled, hanging his head. Kakashi-sensei was right. It'd be a lot harder to use that way, so call up your shadow clones. Let's start again. The silver-haired man said okay, and so began another day of training for the Rasengan. Fu wandered the busy streets of Konoha looking this way and that with a smile on her face. There were so many different stores to choose from. She'd already passed by more restaurants than there were in all of Taki, and they had a movie theater with 3D screens. Honestly, it was nice to just walk around looking like this. There were so many sights, and while it wasn't home, there was a sense of peace that Fu couldn't get while walking around in Taki, not with all the stares and the whispers she got back home. But for now she didn't have to deal with that. The people met her with nods and smiles and friendly waves that left her feeling warm and happy. Now where to go? Maybe she could find a game shop or a bookstore. They could have stuff she'd never even heard of before, and maybe she'd meet someone she has something in common with and make a new friend. She was happy with the ones she had, but she still had a long way to 100 after all. She then blinked as she spied a head of pink hair. Is that sure enough? Now that she was looking, she could tell who it was. Fu beamed as she ran up to one of her new friends. Hey Sakura. The Konoha kunoichi stopped and turned. Fu, she asked, seeming surprised to see her. She smiled as the orange-eyed girl neared. Oh hey, what are you up to? Oh, just looking around, Fu answered. There's just so much to do around here. Yeah, I guess it must seem that way to someone from a small village, she replied. Fu frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Sakura blinked. Fu put her hands on her hips and glared at the pink-haired Girl, you make it sound like I've never seen any of this stuff before. Do you think I'm some kind of country bumpkin or something? Sakura blinked again, then she looked shocked, then she broke out in a panic, waving her hands back and forth and shaking her head. Wait a second, that's not what I meant. I just meant that since Taki's smaller than Konoha, you don't have. I mean, Fu's shoulders trembled as she listened to Sakura stumble over her words, before she finally burst into giggles. I'm just playing with you. Oh, Sakura, calm down, that's a relief. I thought for a second. She grimaced and looked away. I used to have a habit of blurting out things and hurting people. Oops. Fu almost blanched and gave Sakura an apologetic look. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. No, it's okay, you didn't know, and it was my own fault for being thoughtless before. For anyone else that would probably have been pretty funny, Sakura replied. Fu felt like kicking herself. She was just starting to get to know a new friend, and she goes and puts her foot in her mouth. She rubbed the back of her head. You think so? Sakura nodded. Yeah, it was a good joke, not really creative. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have used something like it. Fu gave an awkward chuckle. Well, at least I didn't make a complete ass of myself. Are we good? Sakura nodded. Trust me, that wasn't nearly as bad as what I said before. I realized I had a problem. She then grimaced again. Don't ask, wasn't gonna. Fu knew she wouldn't want to talk about something like that if it was as bad as Sakura made it out to be. So looking for anything in particular or just sightseeing? Sakura asked before something seemed to occur to her. Ah, that's right, Naruto took you for a tour around the village. How was it? Great, I had a lot of fun, Fu answered, smiling brightly. He showed me so many places I want to visit before I go home, and he's just fun to be around, you know. Sakura laughed a bit. I bet he finished off with the Chirakas, didn't he? Fu giggled. I don't blame him for liking it so much. The food's great, and Tucci and I make the place feel warm. Sakura nodded. They're good people, she agreed. So how about you? Are you doing anything right now? Sakura shrugged. Not really, I just had to pick up some stuff. Fu clasped her hands together, looking hopeful. If you're not doing anything, would you maybe like to hang out? I don't see why not, Sakura replied. Fu cheered, happy to spend time with and get to know one of her new friends. Sakura chuckled at her enthusiasm. Is there anything you'd like to do? You name it, I'm up for it. Sakura shrugged. Nothing really comes to mind. I guess we could always go get something to eat. She then crossed her arms. At Chiraka's great and all, but Naruto really should have asked what you liked. Fu waved it off. It's fine, it's a great place. I'm definitely going to go back a few times before the exams are over. Besides, he did show me a few other places, like what the Dango shop and Yakiniku Q. Sakura nodded. Well, nice to know he didn't just show you his favorite spots. Still, what would you like? Fu smiled and closed her eyes. I could always go for some daifukumachi. Sakura chuckled, a sweet tooth. Huh, why am I not surprised? Okay, I know just the place. Fu soon found herself being led into a shop called Gekoim. There wasn't much to say about the building's exterior. It was pretty average overall, save for the sign decorated with images of all manner of sweet treats. The building was pretty standard on the inside too. Hardwood floors with tables lining the walls, but the display beside the counter was full of all kinds of desserts, from anmitsu to mochi cakes to pudding arrayed in various colors. The air was full of a sweet aroma that had her stop just to bask in it for a moment. Great selection, huh? Sakura said beside her. This is easily the best place for sweets in Konoha. Unless we're talking about Dango, then you should go to the Dango shop. I hope so. With a name like that, Fu said with a flat look. I can't believe someone named their Dango shop the Dango shop. That was like naming a ship. How did no one involved have anything to say about that name? Sakura giggled. Her face was easy to read. Yeah, I know, not exactly the most original name, but they know their Dango is Fu made her way to the counter to order. She stopped as she heard Sakura say Anata. Fu stopped and glanced at Sakura before following her gaze. Sure enough, sitting at a table was the blue-haired girl that had fought her teammate. Oh, you know her? Fu asked. Sakura shrugged. Kinda, my team. Hers and Ino's were all in the same class back in the academy. That makes sense, the members of these teams were all about the same age. It hadn't occurred to Fu since she hadn't gone to Taki's academy. She's kinda shy, though she's a lot better than when we were enrolled. I remember she used to hide behind her escort's leg when someone looked at her back then. That was a shame. Anata seemed nice from what little she'd seen of her, and strong. If she was able to beat Kaido, she should be more confident. Maybe they could help and make a new friend. Sakura turned to her, wanna say hi. How? She stopped as she noticed Fu was no longer beside her. The mint-haired girl was quickly making her way to the table where the pale-eyed girl sat. Hi there, Fu greeted behind her. She immediately realized she made a mistake as Anata jumped in her seat, causing the bowl in front of her to fly off the table. It landed on the floor with a resounding crash, a pool of thick red spreading out as Anata's sensei spilled. For a moment no one said anything, then Fu said, oops, she was really scoring today, wasn't she? Anata looked up at her with wide-eyed shock. Fu chuckled sheepishly and rubbed the back of her head. My bad, sorry about that, let me buy you another bowl. Anata blinked, looking to her ruined treat and back you. No, that's okay. No, it was my fault. I should cover it, but I can just take the apology. I don't think she'll take no for an answer, Sakura said as she joined them. Oh, Sakura, Hinata said before looking to the Taki Kunoichi. And your fu, aha, nice to meet you, fu greeted, smiling and closing her eyes. Same, Hinata replied. Sorry about walking off back in the tower. Fu waved her off. Don't worry about it, not like you were the only one that had been sad and embarrassing, but at least she learned not to try that again. They all turned as footsteps drew their attention. An employee of the shop was headed their way, mop in hand and looking none too happy. We should probably make our orders and find a new table, suggested Sakura. In short order the three had taken up another seat. Fu had her daifukumachi. Sakura had some anko dumplings with syrup, while Hinata had a new bowl of zensai. Fu smiled as she took a bite of her treat, humming at the sweet taste as she savored the chewy snack. So what are you doing here, Hinata asked. I ran into Fu walking around town after I'd finished some errands. Neither of us really had anything to do, so we thought we'd hang out, Sakura explained. Fu swallowed and smiled at Hinata. I was doing some sightseeing. Naruto showed me around the village and there are lots of places I want to try out. She then closed her eyes, reached into her pouch and pulled out a deck of cards, brand new, with Konoha's symbol on the back. Not to mention, look for souvenirs. Aren't you kind of taking this lightly, Sakura asked. You're acting like this is a vacation here. For Fu, it kind of was a vacation even with everything else going on. Still, she rubbed the back of her head sheepishly. I don't think so. It's not like I'm shirking my training. Besides, I told you I've always wanted to get out and see the world, and this is the first time I've ever been someplace interesting. So Sakura nodded. I get it, you want to make the most of it. Ha. I just hope I can find something for Shibuki too. Fu replied. Shibuki, is he one of your friends back in Taki? Sakura asked. Fu nodded and smiled brightly. Yep, he's also my village chief. His father took me, and so he's kind of my brother. Hinata's brows shot up while Sakura's jaw dropped. Wait, your brother is the leader of Taki? The pink-haired girl asked. Yep, Fu replied cheerfully. It sounds like you two are close. Hinata notes. Fu nodded. We had something of a rough start, but since he warmed up to me, he's always been there. I try to be a good sister for him. She rubbed the back of her head again. But I know I can be a handful sometimes. Then Sakura frowned. You'd think your teen wouldn't be so quick to blow you off. Just because her brother is respected doesn't mean she is. Hinata said quietly. Wasn't that the truth? Still, it sounded like she spoke from experience. It's nothing, Hinata said, averting her eyes to the floor. Fu frowned. She wanted to press on it, but she didn't think the pale-eyed girl would respond well. Unlike Naruto, who was as exuberant and outgoing as her, Hinata was shy and probably wouldn't open up if prodded. Best move on and try again when she knows her better. Well, I'll get there. Sakura gave her an odd look. So you said your goal was to make 100 friends, right? How far have you gotten? Fu smiled, closing her eyes. Thanks to Tucci and I've got 6. I see, Sakura said before she smiled back at her. Well, sounds like you're well on your way. Yep, the mint-haired girl replied before looking hopefully at the pinkette. We've gotta hang out some more before the exams are over. It's not really friendship when we barely know each other. Sakura nodded. No problem. I did say we could play some trivia together sometime. Yefu cheered. She then looked curiously at Sakura. So do either of you have any siblings? Sakura shook her head. Nope, it's just my parents and me. Hinata looked to the other Konoha Kunoichi and said, I don't think I've ever met them. What are they like? Well, there's not much to say, Sakura began. They're pretty normal overall. I think my parents are retired ninja. They weren't great at the job. Neither of them made it past Gen, and she then scratched her cheek. They can be kind of overbearing sometimes, more so my mom, not to mention embarrassing, especially my dad. He's always joking and he just can't resist making a pun. Fu closed her eyes and smiled. They sound nice, and your dad seems like a lot of fun. Sakura just stared down at her food with an unreadable expression for a moment, causing Fu to frown. I used to actually find them kinda annoying how they'd pry into my life so often. There were times I wished I was on my own, like if I had parents so caught up in their own lives that they didn't have time for me. Fu's frowned deep and unable to understand how Sakura could feel that way, but before she could say anything she continued. But then I thought about my team. I'm sure you know by now Naruto's an orphan and he's always been on his own. Fu nodded and Sakura continued, and you've probably heard about Sasuke's clan and my sensei. He told us what his family was like, and well, suffice to say that's not a pretty story either. The pink-haired girl scratched her cheek. After thinking about all they went through, I'm just grateful to have parents who care. I have a hard time thinking about how stupid I used to be. Fu had been smiling until she said those last words. Don't say you're stupid. Sakura looked up at her. Fu's right, Hinata said, getting Sakura's attention. It's not stupid, you were only thinking of what you knew. Fu nodded. Yeah, you just needed some perspective. After a moment of thought, Sakura replied, I guess so. She then smiled at them. Thanks you guys, I've been pretty hard on myself lately. She then turned to Fu. I'll introduce you next time we hang out. We can play some games at my place. I'm looking forward to it, Fu replied. She then turned to Hinata and How about you, do you have any siblings? Hinata looked away, causing Fu to frown. Oh right, that Niji guy is your cousin, isn't he? He's kinda harsh. What's his deal? Hinata didn't reply, didn't raise her eyes to them. The blue-haired girl raised her hands before her chest, clenching them together tightly. Oh boy, this reminded Fu of her own past flashback. Fu Shibuki cried as he burst into her room, looking around in panic when his gaze landed on her. He sighed in relief and frowned. I can't believe you actually snuck out. I know how much it sucks to stay cooped up like this, but father was just looking out for you. The 7-year-old didn't respond. She hadn't even turned to look at him. She was gazing out the window, her back turned to him. Shibuki stepped closer, for he reached out for her and stopped short when he heard her sniffling. He lowered his hand, his gaze softening. You went and found them, didn't you? Fu turned to him, her eyes red with tears, snot flowing freely from her little face. She ran and buried her face in his chest. He embraced her gently, one hand stroking her hair as she sobbed. Oh Fu, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. End of flashback. Fu grimaced. Hinata must have had some issues with her family too. She was about as outgoing as they came, and she'd had trouble talking about stuff like that back then, even with Shibuki. For someone as timid as Hinata, who she just met. Nope, changed the subject. By the way, great job back in the prelims, Sakura said, and Fu gave her a grateful glance. You've gotten a lot better since the academy, even after seeing your cousin in action. That Kaido guy didn't know what hit him. Hinata smiled and nodded. Thank you, way to go Sakura. Kurenai must be a good teacher, and you must have really been putting in work to grow so much. Hinata nodded. I wanted to be able to support my team. I couldn't afford to stand to the side like I used to, but I could say the same about you. You've changed a lot from when we were in the academy. Yeah, well, my team and I went through some stuff, and Kakashi-sensei's really been putting us through the ringer, but then everyone who made it this far probably worked themselves into the ground, Sakura said. She then looked to her plate and scratched her cheek. Honestly, it's a bit nerve-wracking thinking about how we're going to represent our villages to a bunch of VIPs. I mean, lords will be there. All the more reason to put our best foot forward, Fu said, raising a fist. Just think of everything you went through to get here and go full throttle from start to finish. Here, let's do our best, Sakura replied, somewhat fired up. After a second, Hinata nodded, looking encouraged. Satisfied, Fu took a bite of her mochi and hummed at the taste. Making new friends and eating delicious food, seeing incredible sights, being treated just like anyone else, and doing Taki proud. This trip was everything she dreamed of. It was the next day that Naruto had finally gotten it. He'd glared at the balloon in his hand, focusing on it as he ignored the sounds of his clones training nearby. The sides roiled with tiny bubbles growing larger and faster as he growled until finally popped. The balloon burst, showering the dirt below. Naruto stared at the darkened earth at his feet for a moment before he grinned and let out a cheer echoed by his clones. Good job, Kakashi complimented as he stepped towards the blonde. You made pretty good time too, so what's up next, Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked excitedly. In response, the Jonin reached into his pocket and pulled out another scroll. Naruto watched as he placed it on the ground, and in a burst of smoke a pile of white rubber balls appeared. Here you go, and with that he tossed one of them to him. Naruto caught it and stared at the ball. That ball is a lot thicker than the balloons, and on top of that it's got nothing but air inside. You'll find it's a lot harder to work with than the balloons, the Jonin explained before picking one of the balls up himself, and it's too easy to simply poke a small hole, and then what you need to do is, and then the ball began to shift, large bumps forming this way and that before it exploded with a loud bang, pieces falling to the ground. That Naruto grinned confidently. Got it, Kakashi-sensei. Later that evening, after Naruto and his team had been sent home, the blonde was carefully watering his plants, couldn't let them drown or wait too late in the evening. After all, just as he finished up, he heard a knock on the door. Naruto turned, wondering who it could be. Before running over to it, be right there, he reached and unlocked the door. It opened with a creak to reveal the familiar face of his former sensei and brother figure, Iruka-sensei. The man smiled. Hey Naruto, I heard you made it to the finals. Sorry I couldn't come by and congratulate you, he said before rubbing the back of his head. I've been kinda busy for the past few days. Naruto grinned. It's fine, Iruka-sensei. I know how it is. You've got all your regular work on your plate plus the stuff with the Chunin exams, right? Yeah, I've been pretty swamped, Iruka said with a slight chuckle. Well, come on and I'll whip us up some instant ramen in a second, Naruto said, gesturing for the scarred Chunin to enter. Nah, I'm not hungry, thanks for the offer. I would appreciate some water though, Iruka replied in short order. They were seated at the table. The blonde had let out a whoop when Iruka had told him he'd had news. Karen's DNA test proved she was telling the truth, and they'd seen no signs she'd been lying. Naruto still found it hard to believe he'd have a chance to get to know someone from his family. He couldn't wait until she was out. Afterward, the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had regaled him with tales of his exploits in the exams, how they'd passed the first test, his encounter with Fu, and the fast friendship they'd struck, and of course his prelim match. Irika's jaw dropped as he just blinked, staring at the blonde after silently listened. As he finished with the prelims, "You took down Niji?" he asked in astonishment. "Yep," Naruto said, crossing his arms and nodding proudly, "and I introduced his face to the floor." Irika shook his head. "Well, I mean, I knew you'd grown," but he trailed off and looked out the window. "I've seen a few kids from the Hyuga clan come through the academy in my class, or others. They've all been pretty skilled, no surprise with that family, but Niji was something special, a rare prodigy." Yeah, I think he let that go to his head," Naruto said, leaning back. "He kept going on about how he was fated to win and all, but I showed him." "Yeah, I'd heard about that," Irika replied with a sigh and a shake of the head. "I can't say I'm that familiar with the workings of the Hyuga clan, but I imagine things are complicated, especially now." Naruto made a hum of curiosity. "I don't know much. What I do know is that the clan is divided into two branches, the main house and the branch house. The branch house is subservient to the main house, and there's been some bad blood there, unsurprisingly. I can't imagine anyone would like being stuck as servants to your own flesh and blood, because you were born into the wrong part of the clan, and it's only gotten worse lately." "So Niji's from the branch house then?" Naruto asked. Irika nodded. "And Hinata's from the main one. It's pretty easy to tell. One gets picked by a servant every day, the other walked home alone." Naruto did kinda remember that he'd watched parents pick up the other kids back in the academy. Hinata, though, was always taken home by someone different, so a big part of the clan was servants for the rest. What, because they were born lucky? Was that why Niji seemed to have a chip on his shoulder towards Hinata? That probably had something to do with why Niji thought everything was fated to. Yeesh, weren't they supposed to be nobles or something? I don't really know much more about the goings-on of the Hyuga clan." Irika then looked at Naruto and smiled. "But anyway, how are things going with your team?" That was something Naruto was happy to talk about. The blonde regaled his former sensei with tales of how things had changed between them, how often Kakashi took them to restaurants, how their group training went, how they'd meet together and just hang out while talking about how they could all improve. He'd glanced at the photo he'd taken with his team just days after they'd become Jin and Kakashi, eyes smiling while roughing the boy's hair. Sasuke looked forward uncaringly while Naruto glared at him in jealousy. They'd come a long way since then. By the and Irika closed his eyes and smiled. "I'll admit I understood why you three were put together, but I was still worried after seeing how you got along in class. But I see I shouldn't have been. I'm glad you're all getting along so well." Naruto chuckled. "Yeah, we were probably exactly what you'd expect at first, but I couldn't be happier with how things turned out. They're kinda like family, you know, and that's how it should be." Irika replied with a nod. "You know, between you processing what happened in Wave and how busy I've been with the academy, I never got a chance to tell you how proud I am of you." Naruto looked surprised at that. Irika smiled warmly. "You've grown a lot, and not just in skill. The way you did all you could just to give one kid hope. Never mind all you and your team did for the land of Waves. A lot of people would say you're chasing an impossible dream, but I believe in you." Naruto was silent for a moment, then he smiled warmly. "Thanks, Irika-sensei." With a sigh, Hiruzen stood at the edge of Konoha's hot springs just beyond the bridge that stood over the steaming river that trailed out from the building. He was sorely tempted to rest his old bones in the warm waters for a minute, but he didn't come here to relax, though his reason for being here was personal in some ways. With his hands behind his back, the third god of shinobi slowly stepped over the bridge. He walked past the building and towards the woman's bathing area. He'd suspected that Orochimaru wasn't the only one of his former students to return, given the bonds that had once existed between them and the reports he'd sent. He had little doubt someone else would follow, and he knew just where to look when his feelers had brought whispers that he was right. Sure enough, he was both warmed by nostalgia and slightly disappointed to find a man crouching in front of the wooden fence that hid the woman's side. He was a tall, well-built man with fair skin and waist-length spiky white hair, tied into a ponytail with two shoulder length bangs framing his face. Red lines trailed down from his eyes. He wore a green short shirt kimono with matching pants, under which he wore mesh armor that is visible at his wrists and ankles. He also wore handguards, a black belt, wooden sandals, and a red haori with two yellow circles on each side with a large scroll strapped to his back. He had a blush on his face and was chuckling as he peered into a hole. "Some things never change," Hiruzen mused as he approached. "Should have guessed you'd know where to find me. Old man heard I was in town." The man said as a statement of fact. "When I learned Orochimaru had returned, I thought it safe to assume you would follow Jiraiya."